What is up, fellow sickos? I am Dan Favali, back with our bonus clip pod snippet thingamajig of the week. We're going to talk about Tyrese Maxey, the Sixers, and the role that Tyrese Maxey, but also Rich Paul, apparently played in putting this team in a position to make just a massive splash over the summer. Before we get started, very quickly, subscribe if you haven't already. And if you are a longtime subscriber, make sure you're flooding the comments. Also tell people about us if you've not done so. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, the whole nine. And also check out our merch. The link is in the podcast and YouTube description. The Sicko collection is dope. Feedback on it so far has been awesome. So thank you all for that. And I have not gotten to the messages. I need to send out magnets for anyone who purchased merch. You could still DM me on Twitter. Email us. Emails in the podcast YouTube description. If you're in our Discord, do that. I haven't gotten around to doing that yet, but I promise I will. I have them. We have thousands of magnets for some ungodly reason. Let's talk Tyrese Maxey and the Sixers, though. So there was a clip. Daryl Morey went on the WAIP afternoon show in Philly to talk about kind of the offseason. And there was about it might be a little bit less. It's just a couple minutes that really stood out to me from his interview. The whole thing was sort of enlightening, but I enjoy the discussion about Tyrese Maxey, and kudos to, I think it's Spike Eskin, I hope I didn't get his name wrong, is the one who asked the question. I thought that was a great question because some of the nuance will at times get lost in all this about not what concessions, but what kind of all the steps that were made. Because when you look at Philly, they're in an interesting situation where, okay, this was a team that had boatloads of cap space, could have carved out, if they wanted to, $60+ million. And yet, so they use that cap space. And then as of now, they're a team that's in the tax. That is not, they have some room under the first apron, but they're a team that's in the tax. That just doesn't happen. I'm trying to think of the last time that happened where a team entered the offseason with cap space and then exited it in the luxury tax. Hopefully you now will realize, if you're watching on screen, why I'm off to the side so that this thing could fit. Oh, there we go. There it could fit. There we go. Oh, that hurts my shoulder. It can fit right there. Start of the interview. Let's roll through it.
So one of the big things that allowed this to happen was
right off the bat. I'm going to love this question, but I like that this doesn't look like your typical. This looks like someone that might join us in the HardwoodKnocks Discord to talk about emo music and the latest Blink-182 or Yellow Card concert that they went to. So I fave it.
Tyrese Maxey, you guys not signing him to the extension last offseason, and
which, for those to need to be reminded, if they would have given him a max number, he would have ended up on the books, had they extended him before last season, about $35.1 million. And while he did go on to have a career year and maybe in some people's minds wasn't considered a no-brainer to get that max, I'd probably like to meet the people who didn't think he was a no-brainer. I mean, this is last year there's no denying what he did. 26 points, 6 assists, shot 50% on twos, 37.3% on threes. I thought he improved as a playmaker too overall, but he averaged over 20 points, fit next to the previous season, his third year, was played next to James Harden, played independent of James Harden. The passing, you didn't see as much of it there because he wasn't saddled with as much responsibility, but the iterations, you even look at his second year, he's just been through so many iterations of the Sixers already, proven he could fit inside all of them. So just to be clear, he was for anyone who just forgot, I'm not saying anybody did, I'm not trying to be, a patronizing asshole here. He was a max candidate at this time last year. He was absolutely a max contract. I wouldn't even call it a candidate, but a lock.
Waiting until this offseason so you could sign Paul George. How does the conversation go with Tyrese Maxey, and he's represented by Clutch, so that's Rich Paul, and telling a player, wait till next year, and with the risk, obviously, that he is looking into the future, he could get injured, he could have a bad year, whatever. How do you get him to do that? Because it seems like such a major piece of this happening.
This is an excellent question because we've talked about this on the pod before about the importance. Shout out anyone who could see Cosmo on screen just going ballistic behind me or to the side of me. We talk a lot about why can't teams just force players to wait when it comes to the matter of restricted free agency holds. They have all the power in restricted free agency. I'm not here to relitigate whether restricted free agency should be a thing. It's a thing right now. The players union collectively bargained these circumstances. Teams should use it to their advantage when it's appropriate or when it can actually benefit them, not just for, if they don't believe in the player, it's different, but it's not just for, we're not going to have cap space, we're going to make them wait anyway, to see if we can get them for cheaper somehow. So, but we never think about, well, what is that like? Because we just assume these players are going to be conditioned to trust teams. And maybe that's the case in certain circumstances, but you're an NBA player and you're coming off your first deal. You haven't been caps lock paid yet. I don't care if you're going to be at the franchise for life. You're going to be worried about injuries. This is your first time to lock up generational wealth. And that's like a really big deal. Like, because every contract now in the NBA after that first one is generational wealth, essentially, if you're a really good player. So it is a concession, and it's fascinating to actually ask that question. And you wish that you could almost get more of an unplugged answer of, okay, like, what is that conversation like? Like, how do you convince a player? How do you sell them on this path? And they're going to get into that a little bit. That's why I found this clip fascinating. I know Daryl Morey's comments about Maxey were making the rounds, but I find the stuff we're about to get it about about Rich Paul just as fascinating.
I think, I'm glad you brought it up, because Tyrese deserves, like, he made this offseason happen. Without Tyrese, this offseason can't happen.
And that's also, by the way, I'm not diminishing what Tyrese Maxey's doing here. I'm saying he deserves all the credit in the world. So his cap hold was, and if people don't like the cap nuances, I get it, but his cap hold was $13 million leading into this summer. Had he signed the max, you're talking about he's on the books for $35.1 million. The Sixers still could have had cap space and had him on the max, but it wouldn't have been nearly as consequential cap space. And so you look at what they were able to do in maxing out Paul George, using the room exception to get keep Kelly Oubre Jr., and then be able to sign Caleb Martin. These are not all things they could have done if he was on the books for $35.1 million. And the way cap holds work, just for anyone who might not be familiar, if you're a restricted free agent specifically, let's just use it. You have that, if you meet the starter criteria, there's that, it's not predetermined cap hold, essentially. And that is the amount that you count on the books for while you're a free agent. But because a team has your bird rights, you can, in this scenario, you leave that number on the books, that 13 million. You go about all of your offseason business. And then you are allowed, because the player's still not under contract, but you have his bird rights, like that's the whole point of the cap hold, you then go and sign Tyrese Maxey to his max deal. That's what happened here. That's what he waited on. And by doing so, it doesn't amount dollar for dollar here, but in this case, it kind of essentially does. Like, it afforded Philly $20+ million in additional wiggle room, if not in raw spending power, even though in this case, it probably does. It is a perfect analog, 1-to-1 analog. But that additional flexibility, that's a huge deal. And this offseason does not happen the way it does. They're not even getting to Paul George money if Maxey's like that. Their biggest acquisition, yeah, they could have done the Caleb Martin stuff. They could have signed maybe someone else. They couldn't have gotten Paul George. They wouldn't have had the cap space to even be in the running for OG Anunoby. And like Tyrese Maxey, like without him waiting, because he did have the leverage. You could have said, no, I'm not waiting. And the Sixers would have said tough shit. But do you know what could happen if you do that? You can get to the Gordon Hayward instance where the Jazz were different. They told him to go get an offer, which was hysterical in retrospect. And shout out Gordon Hayward to retirement. I hope daddy's finally happy. If you know. So if you told him no, but we're going to make you wait anyway, he could have went into restricted free agency, not signed with you right off the bat and said, well, I'm going to sign a 3-year offer sheet that gets me into free agency sooner. That's what you're matching. So fuck you for making me wait. That's why the relationship here is super important. But you're talking about a kid in his early 20s, lots of money on the line. He has played up to snuff of a max player. And the other thing here is like they've put him through the ringer of just sort of different utilities when he's been there, with Joel Embiid injured. He's been there, had to play off James Harden, play independent of James Harden. He's there for the whole Ben Simmons situation. And so all of a sudden he is like, he had the midseason where he's taking on this bigger role. And then James Harden comes along after the trade and it has to be adjusted again. So it was well within his right not to wait. And so the fact that because if he would have said to me, if he tells them, no, I'm not waiting, then they're probably going to sign him anyway, they wouldn't wanted to have risked him going into restricted free agency, signing that shorter deal that would have put him in free agency sooner.
All his peers in that draft, I think pretty much all of them who are on the way he was on the way to being an all-star, all got big extensions. So
I think this sounds right, but why don't we go through the draft class and see? So, okay, we have Anthony Edwards. He got the max. James Wiseman did not get an extension. LaMelo Ball, yeah, he got the max. Patrick Williams not on that level. Okoro still not signed as I recorded this by the way. Onyeka Okongwu, he got an extension. They're way cheaper than if this Maxey would have signed Onyeka Okongwu's deal. I think it's what 4 and 64, whatever it was. That Sixers would have pounced at that. Killian Hayes, not currently out of the NBA. He does have a chance to make the Nets. Obi Toppin, he took it to restricted free agency, not a max player though. Denny Avdia, he did not. He signed an extension, excuse me, but it wasn't a max player candidate. Jalen Smith, we know how his deal ended up. Devin Vassell is interesting. He did sign an extension. It was in the $140 million range. So that's not max money, but it's enough to have obliterated the Sixers cap space. And I view Devin Vassell as someone with a potential, all-star like stock. Tyrese Halliburton, yeah, he had the max penciled in. Kyra Lewis Jr., no, not on that level. Aaron Nesmith did sign an extension. So did Cole Anthony. So did Isaiah Stewart. Nowhere near the maxes, though. Alexei Pokusevsky, man, this one hurts. I wish that I wasn't scrolling through this list right now. Josh Green, he got an extension, super cheap. Sadiq Bey took it to restricted free agency. That was rough for him. He did get a multi-year deal, though, post-ACL injury. That's not bad. Precious Achiuwa only got a one-year deal from the Knicks. He took it to restricted free agency, although they never even gave him the qualifying offer. Tyrese Maxey, of course, we know Zeke Nash did get an extension. How's that aged? Leandro Palermo, no. Oof. RJ Hampton, wow, blast from the past. Quickly did not get an extension. He goes to restricted free agency, so the Raptors were able to work with a lower cap hold for him. Again, not a no-brainer max guy. Peyton Pritchard, cheapo extension. Udoka Azubuike, no. Jaden McDaniels, he again got a sizable extension, right in the, I'll put him in Devin Vassell territory. So that could have obliterated the Sixers cap space. Desmond Bane got the max. So with the exception of if you consider McDaniels and Quickly and Vassell having all-star potential, I think Vassell definitely does. We need to see more from J-Mac on the offensive end, of course. And then Quickly is like, I don't know. You can't picture it because of kind of the pecking order in Toronto and the pecking order in New York, but just fringe all-stars, whatever, potential. I'm not saying that's what they are right now. Those dudes signed not the max, but Quickly eventually took it to restricted free agency. So let's consider just Jaden McDaniels and Devin Vassell here, fringe stars or potential all-stars. They don't get the max, but it's a sizable enough money that it would have upended the Sixers' plans. But you look at the actual guys that I think you would call no-brainer. It would shock you. I guess Desmond Bane kind of feels fringe. Would it shock you if he never made an all-star game? Probably not, but that was someone no-brainer right around going to get max money. Ditto for LaMelo Ball, Anthony Edwards, and Tyrese Halliburton. So Daryl Morey is right. Everyone who was kind of in Tyrese Maxey's tier, they did go the extension route. And look, the certain cases matter here. If you're going through these teams, the Timberwolves, they weren't going to have cap space. So you might as well lock Anthony Edwards down. The Hornets, now this is where things get interesting. I think when you're looking at, let's say the Hornets specifically, and even the Grizzlies, they weren't going to have cap space, but let's use even Minnesota would count as this. If you have some Indy too, with how Indy's a perfect example. They could have had cap space this year, even after the Siakam trade, but you would have had to work with Tyrese Halliburton's hold, which we'll get into this in a second. It would have been more sizable than Maxey's because of where he was drafted, but they could have had cap space, but you could have worked with his hold, technically renounced Pascal Siakam or never made the trade. If you're not a market that can picture yourself poaching these big names, or you don't need to just use free agency, you can use trades. But if you're not in the business of we're going to trade a bunch of draft picks and use our cap space to acquire big name players that way, if you're not a team that thinks you can build through that route, then you might as well, even if you can have cap space. I'll use Indy as an example, Charlotte as an example too. You might as well just extend these guys. Now, do I think LaMelo Ball, Tyrese Halliburton certainly had the cachet to say, I'm not waiting. I don't think Indy would have even been interested in going that route. Who knows how much money he could have ended up costing himself with a hamstring injury. They probably still would have maxed him out, quite frankly. But if you're not a market that views itself as a free agency player, or even a team that's going to take big swings on the trade market, I know the Pacers went and traded for Pascal Siakam, but they gave up 3 first-round picks that were that 2026 pick is going to be the most valuable, and it tops out as like maybe middle of the first round. So if you're not a team that feels like it can roll that dice because you're in a market, or free agents typically haven't flocked to you, or you typically haven't made these big time trades. Now, Memphis is an interesting case study with Desmond Bane because it's, well, they already have John Morant. Guys will want to play for him. You weren't going to have cap space anyway. So you might as well just extend Desmond Bane. But when you feel like you have the opportunity to make a bunch of splashes and capitalize on this flexibility, it behooves you to go that route, but you need the player to understand.
So it was very challenging with both Tyrese and his family. They very understandably wanted the extension they deserved and 100% did deserve.
I want to make that clear. There's nothing wrong with that. And that has to be like a difficult discussion. And yes, I think fans can get caught up in, well, if they just promise to pay him, and it doesn't work like that. And you ask James Harden, you probably shouldn't trust Daryl Morey or the Sixers in general. And what's interesting about that is, so this conversation is happening on the heels of, or like amidst all this James Harden drama, where he's calling the Sixers front office liars, saying Daryl Morey's pants are on fire. And so you wonder if that hurts the dialogue. And this is where I find this fascinating, is where the Rich Paul of it all kind of comes into play.
I think Rich Paul was a big factor here, in that Rich is very experienced on being part of winning teams, obviously with his iconic, clients who have won many titles.
I wonder who one of those iconic clients is. Gary Trent Jr. doesn't have an NBA championship. Who's like, just how many of Rich Paul's clients have NBA championships and are iconic? Nothing springs to mind, but I'll trust Daryl Morey here.
With multiple teams and them having to put those teams together, Rich became very important for us to help explain this. That, obviously coming from us is pretty biased, but
James Harden would probably agree there.
For Rich to go to him and say, like, hey, I get what they're doing and this is a good plan, I think that was a big factor.
That's a huge factor, because it's not at that point, in theory, and there will probably be clients of Rich Paul's that might complain, and people do get caught up in the LeBron of it all. He is never just per Kobe stands and MJ's fans. It's just a bummer that LeBron's never won a title. Maybe one time he'll win a championship, but people just view Rich Paul as this extension of LeBron James, and in some ways maybe he is, but this is someone who has a Rolodex of just really impactful NBA players and athletes on his client list. And for him, like, he has a cachet. He's good at what he does. I'm not here to argue that. I mean, the campaign that they went on with just LeBron taking the pay cut, or the willingness to take a pay cut to bring in guys as nondescript, I would say, in the grand scheme of taking pay cuts for, as Jonas Valanciunas, kudos to them. I think a lot of people sore through it, but LeBron and his camp come off smelling like roses here. And really, even if they didn't take a pay cut, this all falls on the Lakers front office. Not about the Lakers, though. So having him in your corner, essentially, like, that's a big deal, because that is someone who legally and in spirit has Tyrese Maxey's best interests at heart. Now, Nerlens Noel might argue against this, but with all sincerity, if you're hearing that from your agent, who you have more of a relationship with, that yes, it's a working relationship, but his job is to make you the most money possible, because then they make the most money possible. To hear that from them is absolutely instrumental. And to have Rich Paul's backing here is a big deal, because when you look at what was happening with James Harden, like, Daryl Morey doesn't come out of that situation looking all that great. I think most people sided with the Sixers if they had to pick a side and all of that. But to have his stamp of approval like that, honestly, if he's telling, like, here's the thing. I'm not saying players always listen to their agents, and I sometimes feel like we overstate how agents can steer players towards certain teams, but their input matters, especially when you're coming to your first, let's call it your second contract, but your first big deal for these players coming off their rookie scales. So if Rich Paul had said, you should know we're going to push for the max now, Tyrese Maxey's probably listening to him in large part, because that view gets him paid 9 figures or locks him down 9 figures, because his salary wouldn't have increased right away. So Rich Paul helped ensure that Tyrese Maxey's cap hold stayed $22+ million below what it was going to be, and now currently is. And if he doesn't do that, if Maxey doesn't accept what Rich Paul is saying, you don't sign Paul George. And then what happens? Yes, you could have done these other things, like the Kelly Oubre Jr., Caleb Martin. You are not the same level of team at that point. There was no alternative scenario. You weren't getting OG Anunoby based off what the Knicks paid him. There's no scenario in which you are in the discussion for the second best team in the Eastern Conference leading into next season. And now you might just be considered the favorites in the non-Celtics division in the Eastern Conference. The Knicks are there. I think Cleveland probably deserves mention, as does Milwaukee. But you're there because of this. And you know what else Tyrese Maxey did? This is not, I mean, I guess it's Rich Paul adjacent because he's Tyrese Maxey's client. But like if Tyrese Maxey doesn't, I know Joel Embiid's on and off splits, yada, yada, yada. But if Tyrese Maxey's not as good as he is either, again, 26 points, 6 assists, 50+% shooting on twos, 37.3% on threes, a nice mix too. Like this is someone who generates his own shot, but can also work away from the ball. If he's not as good as he is, if this is not someone who you look back on that season and say, yeah, like that was essentially his, well, it wasn't essentially, it's his all-star coming out party. He wins most improved player, by the way. So yes, he ensures that the Sixers have, not that they would have had any excuses, but it wasn't just about him becoming a max player. He entered legitimate stardom. And now you have that as a baseline for when Paul George is looking at other options. If Tyrese Maxey isn't Tyrese Maxey, honestly, Joel Embiid injured all the time. And even when he's playing, he's won an MVP. He's a fantastic player. When he's healthy, he's one of the 5 to 10 best players in the NBA. But availability matters. Sustainability matters. He's banged up in the playoffs all the time. Do I think he would have been attractive enough alone if that's the only star on the Sixers' roster? Probably not, because they were working with such a bare bones roster in like going after Paul George to have the amount of cap space that they did. They had, I mean, technically speaking, Joel Embiid was the only player under guaranteed contract, but you penciled Tyrese Maxey in there. We had Ricky Council the fourth penciled in there. So you had so few incumbent players on your roster that would appeal to Paul George because his max is so high. So Tyrese Maxey helps you on multiple fronts. He helps you financially, and then just functionally, rationally, as part of your sales pitch, Paul George, hey, you get to come play with Tyrese Maxey and Joel Embiid. You get to come play with 2 stars, not just one. And if the selling point is, well, we have Tyrese Maxey, he's like up and coming, and we think he could be like, if we're just saying, like, does Paul George feel the same way if Tyrese Maxey has an identical season to what he did in 2022 and 2023? Even that was a hell of a season. 20 points, 3.5 assists, 51.3% on twos, 43.4% on threes. I think the diet, though, when you look at the breakdown and the splits, the shot quality was probably a little bit easier. I mean, maybe, but you can't guarantee that. They were able to point to 2 incumbent all-stars, one of which just won most improved player. The other one is fresh off his MVP. I know he didn't win this summer. I'm talking about the previous season. You have all of that in a box that you're able to take to Paul George in addition to your cap space. And that's not just a difference maker. Those are defining factors here. And so it's not hyperbole to say Tyrese Maxey saved the Sixers from a fate that would be, I would say, fairly ambiguous or mediocre at absolute best. And that Rich Paul, he saved the Sixers too from that, because he's the one that convinced Tyrese Maxey to give the Sixers the financial benefit. And if not convinced, he at least helped map it out for him. And so without the cooperation of those 2 parties, who are one singular party together in all of this, the Sixers are not in the position that they are right now, which is, yeah, there's questions and they still have moves to make. But like, think about this too. They still have, if you want to include Jared McCain, they have Jared McCain plus 4 first-round picks they could dangle in trades. They still have the ability to aggregate too, by the way. They just can't take back more money than they receive. I won't get into targets because we talk about that with Brian Toporek, I think, upcoming this week. But now, had you not gotten Paul George, you probably feel a sense of urgency to now use those picks to just figure out an alternative. Are you giving up those picks to maybe enter the Lowry market in sweepstakes, or are they even enough? I honestly have no idea. If you're not sending actual players back and it's Jared McCain and 4 first-round picks, I don't think Utah views that. But that's kind of the point, like, as acceptable. And then that's kind of the point. Who's the best player you could trade for? And your pick equity is bankrupt at that point. Now you have Paul George, you have Tyrese Maxey, you have Joel Embiid, Caleb Martin, Kelly Oubre Jr. You're able to re-sign Kyle Lowry, who is, let's look at that trickle-down effect. Is he, as Eric Gordon, maybe he always just comes. Does Kyle Lowry kind of just accept, like, you won't even give me the 120% raise, I'm just going to come back on a minimum and play in Philly if Paul George isn't there, or if this other stuff doesn't happen? I mean, maybe, but it makes it a lot easier for him to do so. You're a more attractive destination for even guys like a Reggie Jackson. There's more meaning behind signing Kenyon Martin Jr. to that inflated deal. He always would have taken the inflated deal, but you kind of wonder what's your end game at some point when you're doing that. And you probably still do that anyway, just to have the trade chip in place, but it's not as valuable if you had to use those first round picks to come up with contingencies, plans B through Q. So Tyrese Maxey, and this was a masterstroke in cap management by the Sixers. The credit needs to go all around. Even give it to Joel Embiid for not requesting a trade as soon as the James Harden shit broke out. But there was so much at stake here. Joel Embiid is over the age of 30 now, folks. They're not, and I know Paul George is older. He's over the age of 34, but you don't have the luxury of time as young as Maxey is. Yeah, he's that bridge into the future. But because he is what he is now, which is a fucking all-star, and because he was then willing to wait on guaranteeing his payday. And I think we frame it, and I'm guilty of this too, as throw like, oh, it's just a lot easier decision as it is. You're still going to get life-changing money, even if you get injured. The risk is still there. I've mentioned it time and again with Jalen Brunson as well. So this was a huge deal. And it, by virtue, it made the Sixers what they are right now. And the other thing is, more teams should follow suit. I understand, I went through it, if you're not going to have cap space, but if you're, let's use the Houston Rockets, who Grant and I talked about extensively with this a week or two ago. Now, look at Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun's situation. The Houston Rockets can comfortably get to over $60 million in cap space if they decline Fred VanVleet's team option next year and then renounce Jalen Green and Alperen Sengun. Renouncing them is not an option if you extend them. But if you want to keep them while also having cap space, there's sort of at the opposite ends of two different opposite ends of the spectrum, where sometimes the cap hold is so high it doesn't matter. So you're looking at the max salary for players in Green's and Alperen Sengun's situation moving forward, a little bit over $38 million. Jalen Green's cap hold, he's a number 2 pick when he goes into restricted free agency, $37.4 million. That's not worth it to say, well, we need to carry his cap hold. You don't extend him because you want to make him more tradable, or you're considering actually renouncing him to capitalize on that flexibility. If he's willing to sign for much less, that's when it's, an extension's worth it. It's going to be less than his cap hold. But you start getting deeper into the draft, where Alperen Sengun was drafted. What was he, number 16, I want to say? I hope I'm not wrong there. That was an OKC pick, but yeah, 16. His cap hold, now, same max, could be over $38 million, but his cap hold next summer, if they let him get to restricted free agency, $16.3 million. So not nearly as stark as Mac. I mean, it's only a little bit more, and relative to the cap going up, it's not much more at all. $16.3 million versus 38 plus. It's more than $22 million. That's a $22 million difference, So you keep it. The idea would be, yes, we still want to build around Sengun, but we want to have access to this cap space. And so let's just assume Jalen Green's not part of the equation here, that they're going to renounce him. You can carry Alperen Sengun on the books, $16.3 million next year. And then you resign him to whatever it takes after you go about your business. You take that away from their projected cap space, you're still sitting on over $40 million in cap space, folks. That's not the tippy top max money, but you have other things that you can do if you, want to reach that money. And that would include, you're trading somebody at that point. Actually, they don't have any guaranteed money in the books. That's throwaway money at that point. So you could look at, though, in theory, if you want to open up, is it move Tyrese in? Is it move Cam Whitmore? Do you look at moving Dylan Brooks, who has guaranteed money that year? That's the most easy, most likely one, because you're declining Fred VanVleet's team option. Dylan Brooks, $21.1 million. Do you move him for cheaper players or just into someone's cap space because you can? I'm saying if you need $40 million, for more than $40+ million, they probably won't, looking at the free agency class. But cap space is not just about free agency. It's also about trades. And so the Rockets can set themselves up to make a really big splash in the trade market. Yes, they can do that if they have matching salary on the books, but some teams are not going to be as gung-ho about, we want a Jalen Green on a max over the summer, or we near max, or we want Alperen Sengun on a max. You're offering them flexibility in those trades. And then, yeah, of course, there will always be 1 to 5 free agents worth a damn. And if the Rockets are good again, they have a top 7 defense and their offense improves, they're going to be appealing. That's a market that you would look at and say, yeah, it's worth them to roll the dice. Now, what Orlando did with Franz Wagner, I still think they should have made him wait, just because I don't view him as a no-brainer max. I don't know that some of the teams that are slated to have cap space, I don't know how many would have aggressively gone after him. I'm certainly, if you wanted the max, I don't think it would have been harm in waiting, but they weren't a team after the way they went about their business this year, because they did put guaranteed money on their books for next year with KCP, and you're also going to have to deal with Jalen Suggs' cap hold. I understand why they would come to be not in a rush, but they would consider not waiting on these. Again, I think it's different if you don't view them as a no-brainer. This is going to be an all-star, and so we don't want to max them out. And I think Franz Wagner is a really good player. Just don't think he's at that guaranteed level just yet. Maybe I'm wrong, and this works out fine. But you wait if you think that they're valuable. Hey, prove it, and we're going to pay you. We have matching rights if you're good enough to do it. But Jalen Suggs is interesting because that's someone, his draft status, it doesn't make sense to just, I mean, it does because the max is 38 plus. His cap hold is 27.6 million. So there's still a difference of more than $11 million there, about $11 million there. And so those are tougher. Those are more complex situations. And is Orlando really a free agency destination? You look at all their salaries. They're these digestible hits. Not all of them are guaranteed. They did, again, KCP guaranteed for not just this season, but next season. But like Gary Harris working on another team option that year. Ditto for Mo Wagner, another team option that year. So like you still have that flexibility, but the numbers are so small, $11 million, $8 million, but that their digestible and movable salary is expiring, where when it's bigger money type deals, it gets just a little bit more complex. So I can understand Orlando's rationale here, especially if they don't now, because Franz Wagner's cap hold would have been smaller than Suggs, by the way, because he was drafted after him. So if you don't have Jalen Suggs on the books, let's just say he's not on the Magic or he's not going to be a free agent, then yeah, I'm probably saying, well, then Orlando should have definitely just worked with Franz's cap hold because they have an easier path to flexibility, even with KCP on the books. Their situation, again, it's a little bit more intricate, but Philly exists as it is today, thanks to Tyrese Maxey, thanks to Rich Paul, thanks to, of course, insane cap management by the Sixers, but this doesn't happen without the cooperation of Tyrese Maxey, which apparently didn't happen without the sales pitch, the explanation from one Rich Paul, who, I don't know, again, I can't think of these iconic clients that he has that Daryl Morey was referencing. If someone could let me know who Rich Paul represents, I'm just blanking. That would be considered like better than Tyrese Maxey. Drop a comment on YouTube. Just drop comments anyway. Hit us on our Discord. Link is in the podcast and YouTube description. Hope you're enjoying these bonus clips. Until next time, and as always, remember to subscribe across all platforms and tell your friends, family members, acquaintances, coworkers, enemies on the street and social media about us. But two, and most importantly, shout out as always to the one, the only, the indelible Frank Ntilikina.